Um, our speaker tonight is Nancy Calhoun. She is in Oklahoma right now. She's been chasing relatives for over 40 years. While in Teacher Corps, a graduate school in Kansas, she enrolled in a semester-long genealogy class and has been pursuing family, both her own and others, since that time. With a teaching background and 20 years in newspaper work and publishing, she often used her research skills in the classroom and in writing. I could go on. Nancy has provided me a really good profile of what she has accomplished in life, but we need to be out of this room by 8 o'clock, so I have to. If you would join me, please, in welcoming Nancy. Nancy, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Okay, thank you so much. Can you hear me? Okay, yes. This presentation is based on my mother's family. Her maiden name was Annie Smith. So this is called Shakin Out the Smiths. Tips on researching a common surname. I'm sure many of you have common surnames. Smith, when this list was made, was the most frequent in the United States, followed by Johnson, Williams. I have 3 Williams grandmothers who happen to be cousins. Joneses, Browns, Davis. No, is anything sounding familiar? I think I've researched most of these names. So, this is my mother, Ann Smith Calhoun, and she's there with her older brother, Raymond Smith. And this poor child, my grandparents were so poor they didn't even give him a middle name. Huh. This is her father, and his name was James Allen Smith. These are the most common names at that time in the United States. My mother, as a little girl, with her brother Raymond. My grandfather, James Allen Smith. And he worked as a cowboy in Texas and a chuck wagon cook. So he was rather a mobile person. But by the time of his marriage, he had settled in Grayson, Oklahoma, and here they're playing the rather genteel game of croquet. This is my grandmother. Her name is Della Maddie Hendricks. And of course, it was Smith after she married my grandfather. And that was the most helpful thing he did because I didn't start genealogy until after his death, but she could tell me a great deal. So here they are about the time of their 50th wedding anniversary. My mother with her family, except for her baby sister, who they called Babe until she was about 2 years old. In fact, they called her Babe all her life. Seated on my grandfather's lap is her youngest brother named Jerome. And that turned out to be a real help in the research because my grandmother told me that he was named for his great uncle on the Smith side. So I had one more name to add to my Smiths. This family was involved in a small town telephone company in Gracemont, Ninnekah, and Lenapaw. This is my great aunt Maud, and she's seated at the switchboard in Lenapaw. You notice she was multitasking, working the switchboard. The dishes are all washed. A freshly pressed dress, which she probably made, is on the bed. So that common occupation gave me some hints in following this family. But my grandmother was a great source of information. Talk to your relatives. Talk to your cousins. Often we will have similar stories, but there may be some detail that will enable you to continue your research if you talk to your relatives. This is my grandfather's parents, Rachel Mulroney and her husband, um, who was referred to as Babe by the entire family. Anytime I said, "What was Grandfather Smith's name?" the family member would say, "It was Babe." Well, I even found that name on official documents, but I also found him by several other names. So, one of the first things I would recommend doing is interview your living relatives and take notes. Ask for dates, places, names for pedigree charts, and family group, and those great stories that enable you to flesh out the bones. Do repeat visits. My grandmother would meet me at the door and say, "I remembered something else." Ask about Bibles and obituary collections, funeral programs, and funeral books. These can give you a great deal of information. Ask about photographs and documents. These are valuable resources, and they also prompt memories. I visited in a nursing home with my mother's cousin. Um, and she was down that day. She was obviously very depressed. And I pulled out a photograph that was of her family when she was very young. And I said, "Dutch, who's this photograph of?" And she immediately brightened up, and with great love in her voice, she said, "That's my family." So I set out to gather information on Babe Smith after I won the use of a professional researcher at a genealogy event I went to. I found he died in approximately 1900 at Shawnee, Oklahoma. He had moved there from Ennis, Texas, but he was originally from Tennessee. He had a twin daughter named Leela, who died at Ennis and was buried southwest of Ennis. Her twin sister was named Annie, and she had married a man named Charlie Darnold, and she was buried near Mauderdale, somewhere out in there. He had a brother named Jerome, and he had served in the Civil War, but grandmother could not tell me which side. His wife's maiden name was Mulroney, and she had a photograph of her brother Frank marked McMinnville, Tennessee, which turned out to be a great tool because this is how I determined where they came from in Tennessee. Use the standard resources, publications that list marriages, wills and probates, county histories, military service, city directories, and cemetery listings. Online resources that I used were local websites and also military websites. Some of the documents include death certificates, Social Security applications, land records, and marriage records. And use the experts, persons knowledgeable about the area. In this case, I used the Pottawatomie County Genealogical Society, and I also used a resource in Tennessee. And, you know, I usually don't go to professional researchers, but often they are really worth the money. Um, Go to the scene if you can. It's difficult for us to do that, but this can be helpful. Travel to the locality. And in this case, it confirmed what Speaker Markelo talks about, follow the land. The area they came from in Tennessee was known as a garden area. But when I went to Ennis, Texas, in Ellis County, when we rounded, we found we're on our way to the cemetery, turned a corner, and here was this rich, fertile river valley stretching out before us. The same thing was true in Pottawatomie County, Oklahoma. His Um, his claim to land rested in the South Canadian River Valley. Again, a wide open river valley of fertile land. And visit local libraries if you can. Family files may not be as popular as they once were, but they can be a valuable source of information, which I found in McMinnville Library in Tennessee when I visited there, and also in the libraries I've visited in Texas, where I found a letter from a fellow cousin, and we exchanged information for years. So this is the 1900 census for Oklahoma Territory, and this was found by the Pottawatomie County Genealogical Society. I'm always a little overwhelmed when I'm searching for Smiths, but um, but they found this for me. 1900 census Oklahoma Territory, that's for Oklahoma statehood. And it says that his name is J.L. Smith. Remember, I just know Babe, and I had found by ordering my grandfather's Social Security application that his name was actually James. So the L I found on other documents stands for Lycurgus. But there's also a D here, and I still don't know what that D stands for. But for the first time, I have his month of birth and also the year of birth. Now, I knew his wife's name was Rachel, so that's helping me confirm that this is my great grandfather. And this also gave me her birth date. Their daughter named Annie, and I knew they had a daughter named Annie, born in October of 1882. And then my grandfather named James. And I knew, from years of birthday parties when his birthday was May of 1888. But there's something here that's surprising. There's a William Collins, and he's listed as a son in law. Remember, Annie married Charlie Darnald. So who is this William Collins? Well, I discovered through marriage records that Annie had married him first. I don't know what happened to him, but he disappears from the face of the earth after trying to apply to be the executor of his father in law's estate. Rachel replied and said, I am perfectly capable of handling this myself. And she did. And William Collins disappeared. This was probably taken about the time of Babe's death. So we have Rachel on the left, and my grandfather, who was about 12 years old when his father died. You remember the photograph earlier of Rachel? Well, that's what homesteading in Oklahoma does for you. A year after Babe's death, she married a man named William Bobo Bavidi. And this photograph was taken in Ellis, Texas, which probably indicates that she knew him before they came to Pottawatomie County. Um, Rachel actually homesteaded after her husband's death. Single women who were head of households or single women who were unmarried and over 21 could file for homesteads, and Rachel did that. So when I went to Ellis County, Texas, I went to the local library, and they had a cemetery book, and it listed this Leela F., daughter of J.L. and Rachel Smith, and gives her birth date and her death date. She died when my grandfather was approximately a year old, so he really never knew this sister, but he knew her twin. So, thanks to that cemetery listing, we found directions to the cemetery, and also um, were able to go back there. We knocked on a nice lady's door, and she gave us a ride in her pickup because she said, You'll never make it in your car. So we stumbled around the cemetery, and actually, my cousin actually tripped and fell, and this stone was right there in front of her.
Huh.
So I do what I call play the name game, and I use surnames associated with the family. Not just Smith. Of course, Mulroney, which was great grandmother's maiden name. Mavidi, uh, which is her second husband's name. Collins, and I look for other family members to confirm the find, such as in that 1900 census. I knew those names that were all associated and tied them to the geography. Luckily, this family did not have very itchy feet. They went from Tennessee to Ellis County, Texas, to Pottawatomie, Oklahoma, to Caddo County, Oklahoma. Search using the more unusual given names if their name is common, such as Rachel is a more common name. So this is a photograph my great grandmother had in her magic suitcase that she let me go through, and this photograph is of great grandmother's brother, Frank Mulroney, and his wife. And you notice on the front that this photograph was taken in McMinnville, Tennessee. This was my first hint that this family came from Warren County, Tennessee. So, with that information, I was able to find Rachel and Babe's marriage in the county records. I was able to find them on the census, and I was able to make contact with one of Frank Mulroney's great granddaughters. In fact, I recently sent her this photograph because she did not have a photograph of her great grandparents. So, as I said, I found the great granddaughter of Frank Mulroney, and I also found the great grandmother of Jerome, Babe's brother. Remember Jerome that my Uncle Jerome was named for? That turned out to be great information. This is the 1880 Warren County census. And remember, I'm looking for a James Smith. Well, he's listed on here as like Curtis Smith, which is how I found him listed in military records and in his father's will. But it was confirmed that this was my James Smith because the spouse's name is Rachel. And who's living in the household with them? None other than her brother, Frank Mulroney. So they're listed on this census page, and farther down on the page, it's listed Jerome Smith with his wife Millie, and they're living with his mother, whose name is Ann Smith. I knew my mother was named for her aunt, but I didn't know that aunt was named for her grandmother. So when I look at the 1860 Warren County census for James Smith, I find no less than 9 of them. But I'm looking, I need one that was about the right age. Remember on the 1900 census, Babe was it said he was born about 1844. So he would have been about 16 now. Well, if I narrow this down, when I look at the ages, there's only one 16-year-old. So when I bring up that 16-year-old, his mother is Ann Smith. Remember, Jerome was living with his mother, Ann Smith. And his father's name is John Smith. I was hoping once I got past all those Jameses and Anns, there'd be some decent names, but no, his father's named John Smith. And remember Jerome Smith, he was slightly older than Babe, but he's listed as being 70 years old here. Well, this is, and there's three sisters listed, and that's going to be important too. If you look at the original census, suddenly that Jerome Smith that they interpreted as being 70, take a look at that 7. I think it has a tail on it. It was just misinterpreted. He's actually 20, which makes him the perfect age to be our Uncle Jerome Smith. And I needed to pay attention to these sisters too. It's there's one sister that's not on this one. She's on the 1850. And I could not find the grandfather's will anywhere. So finally, I had the microfilm for the probate records for Warren County, and so I started going through them page by page, and I wrote down all the names associated with my Smith family. Finally, I found that will. It was indexed by the executor's name, who was a son-in-law. So it's important to pay attention to those branches on the family tree. So remember, grandmother told me he was in the Civil War, but she didn't know which side. There were 1,200 James Smiths in the Civil War. So I searched under the brother's name, Jerome Smith, which is less common. And listed near him in the list was Lycurgus Smith. Remember the name he went by on the 1870 census? Plus, there were several others from the neighborhood. We were looking for names associated with them. There were several Gribbles. In fact, several Gribbles were killed in the Battle of Murfreesboro, and there's a monument for them in their home county. I found his service record. It said he was severely injured and sent to the hospital. He had enlisted in the next county east. Murfreesboro is in the next county west. And remember Jerome? I got his service records. He had served for almost the duration of the war, and he was released as a prisoner of war. And when he signed his oath of allegiance, he said, I'm tired of this war. All I want to do is go home to Tennessee. So, and how did I find what unit they were in? Well, I looked in the soldiers and sailors system. I frequently use this research when I'm trying to determine where a family came from. So here's Jerome Smith. He's serving in the 16th Regiment Tennessee Infantry. If you click on his name, you get some information on him. If you click on the name of the regiment, you get some history of the regiment. Well, here's the history of the 16th Regiment. And it mentions that they were at Murfreesboro. Remember, that's where James was, or Lycurgus was severely injured. And look at all these Gribbles. These are neighbors. The Gribbles are neighbors and friends of the Smiths, even in North Carolina. So although they weren't married into the family, they were always close neighbors. So here we have Jerome Smith, and 5 lines after that we find Lycurgus Smith, not James Smith, Lycurgus Smith, and he's in the same unit. So here's his listing. So, and how do you know? Is this really mine? I know I had put things aside because I wasn't sure it was mine, James Smith. Well, does it list names of other family members? Does it list other locations where you know this individual lived? Look for in-laws with less common surnames and check the dates and ages. It's really helpful to pay attention to closer attention to these things whenever you're researching someone with a common surname. So these are some of the names I found great grandfather Smith under. Remember, the family just called him Babe Smith. Well, I have a James Smith, an L.D. Smith, a James L.D. Smith, a J.L.D. Smith, a James L. Smith, a J.L. Smith, a Jas L. Smith. Of course, Jas is a abbreviation for James. I find three spellings alike her, just all three in his father's will. B. Smith, Bob Smith, which is probably just bad handwriting, and Babe Smith. And these last two were actually listed in his daughter's um, marriage license application. So, starting with my James Allen Smith, I've gone up to James L.D. Smith, a John Smith, and what do I find out? John Smith's father was also John Smith. And John Smith's wife's name was Anne Smith. His grandmother's name was Jane Smith, and she was born in Ireland. Now, how many Janes do you think immigrated from Ireland? And I don't have a maiden name. So associate your common surname with others. Um, wills, military units. Tennessee has a great set of books that are questionnaires that were sent to Civil War veterans in 1890. Um, by looking for all the people who served in Company D, um, I found a man who was in that who was in that same unit. And one of the questions they ask is, who did you serve with? The last two people he lists is Jerome Smith and L. Smith. My people. So and of course we all love the census. Look at the great information I got from the census. How about letters they've written? Deeds, marriages, and look at neighbors and look at the diaries. In North Carolina, I found a journal in a university archives, and the man lived in the same area of North Carolina as the Smiths did, and he would write down who he visited every day, and he was frequently at the Smith house for supper. So look at the neighbors. Remember, there's a Thomas Gribble who seemed to be best friends with John Smith, and the blacks are always closely associated. The Polk family, who are President Polk's family, and there was a Miller family. And in fact, for a long time, I suspected that Anne's maiden name might have been Miller. Remember, the family came from Mecklenburg County, North Carolina. And I found that information in a family history book about a family associated with the Smiths. And in fact, one member had married into the Smiths. And they stated that a number of brothers came from Mecklenburg County to Warren County, Tennessee. So I actually found while Googling late at night one night, and if I'm going to Google at night, I usually don't Google Smiths. I found letters written by Tom Smith and Thomas Gribble. They were old friends and neighbors in Mecklenburg County, North Carolina. There was a nasty rumor going around that President Polk's grandfather and some of the Polks were Tories. And John Smith wrote, I was born in 1775 in Mecklenburg County, North Carolina. And he said none of the Polks were Tories, which, that was just gold to me. It's still a nugget in my genealogy treasures. If only he had said the son of so and so. So, and also connected to that were two Alexanders who sent a newspaper publisher to talk to them and get the letters of character. And they made statements about the good characters John Smith and Thomas Gribble, which I really appreciated. You know, they could have been horse thieves and chronic liars. Okay. So I need to add one more surname to be associated with the family and check that out. And I have found that a John Smith served in the War of 1812 unit under an Alexander in Mecklenburg County, North Carolina. But so far, this has not met my test to make sure that this is my John Smith. So at that time, I decided to wade right in. And this was the year of the Smiths. So I checked John Smith's on the U.S. Census in Mecklenburg County, North Carolina, assuming that there was a John Smith behind every tree. But to my surprise, there wasn't. In 1790, there were three that were 16 and over. In 1800, there were two that were 26 to 44 and one over 45. That meets the ages of my John Smith Jr. and Sr., with one to spare. In 1810, none were listed, to my surprise. And in 1820, there was one that was 45 and over, and one male that was over 16. That meets the ages of my John Smiths exactly. By 1830, they were probably in Warren County, Tennessee. Okay, so I made a plan of attack. Do you do that? You make a list. I'm going to check this. I'm going to check that. I'm going to check this. Was John Smith Sr. in the Tennessee legislature? As a matter of fact, he was. I I not only found it in a newspaper article in the family file at McMinnville, but I found it in the Warren County history book. But he isn't in the biographical books for Tennessee of men who served in the legislature. So how about an obituary? It seems as though someone that was um rather prominent in Warren County would have had an obituary, but I haven't found that yet. But remember, he probably died during the Civil War, and lots of newspapers were suspended there in that area. I need to look at Mecklenburg County, North Carolina land records more closely. I need to look at other legal records, including probates. I need to look at the Tennessee newspaper, which published those letters from Gribble and Smith. Who were those Alexanders? The Alexanders were a rather prominent family back in North Carolina. But I did find a will abstraction, and it named William, John, and Thomas Smith. Again, these are all three really common names. Why they couldn't have had an Archibald in there somewhere, I don't know. But these are the names of the Smith brothers who came to Warren County. There was also a power of attorney to Thomas Smith by William O. Smith, and the William who came to Warren County usually used the O initial, and John Smith Jr. about the time that they moved to Warren County. And I found that Willa John Smith filed under his son-in-law's name. So pay attention to those branches. This is from my grandmother's magic suitcase, and she happened to have a photo album that belonged to Rachel. This photograph is not labeled, but I happen to think that it portrays a typical Smith researcher who has been searching for days and not finding anything. So, to summarize this, I recommend interview your living relatives and look at their collections. I have a little black book that's 50 years old, and I still go back and look at it. Think, did I miss this? Go to the actual sites if you can. Look at other family members and their associates. Double check everything. In Pottawatomie County, Oklahoma, I was looking for the will of Babe Smith. There happened to be 3 James Smiths who died in that county between 1900 and 1910. But and the microfilm was missing. But I contacted the Genealogical Society, and they were able to find the will for the right James Smith. How did I know it was mine? By the people who were named in it: Rachel, James, Annie. And also, they had written in the margins Warren County, Tennessee, and Ellis County, Texas, both his previous residences. Now, if I had gotten an abstraction of it, they probably wouldn't have written what was scribbled in the out on the edges of the paper. But because I had an actual copy of everything, I got the information. Obtained traditional resources: censuses, deeds, wills, newspapers, church records, which is how I determined approximately when Jerome died, Social Security applications, birth records, death records, and marriage records. And you want the military records of them and others. So, but the most important thing you can do is find your own Granny Smith. So this is the lady that made everything possible. But there's just a little bit more to the story. I talked a cousin that I had never met before into doing a Y test. He was a last male Smith in a direct line in the family. And I took the family finder test, of course. And I proclaimed one year to be the year of the Smiths. I was going to NGS in Raleigh, North Carolina, and I attended every available session on North Carolina research, especially Mecklenburg County, and I haunted the state library and archives.
Woo.
I decided I was just going to hunker down and dig deep. And then the DNA matches came in. And there were hardly any Smiths on that Smith test. How could that be? But then a man contacted me and said, Can I take a look at your DNA test? And I said, You might as well. It's not doing me any good. And he said, I'm looking at Byers. You have a lot of Byers DNA. And I said, What? I thought he was talking about my father's side of the family, because there's Byers in Southwest Virginia. But we weren't related to them. But no, he was talking about Byers in Warren County. Well, it turns out that all of these Byers that there was DNA that matched ours was descended from a couple that came from Warren County, Tennessee. This is William O. Smith. He had a daughter named Adeline Smith, who happened to be a sister of John Smith, a cousin of John Smith. And she married a Samuel Hand Byers. Now remember, this is straight male line, so she doesn't count. Although we are related to her, and there'd be DNA, but it won't be on that straight male line. And their son happened to have gone to Ennis County, Texas. It's Harold G. Byers. And he had several children who were at about the right age to reproduce. So it seems that instead of being Smiths, our family may actually be bars. And James and Rachel were older when my grandfather was born. He was born in 1888. So I'm not sure which generation this cross pollination took place on, but he was their cousin anyway. So James was already their cousin through Adeline. So maybe they thought, well, James and Rachel always wanted a little boy. This is kind of embarrassing that we have this woods colt in the family. Let's give this baby to James and Rachel. So who knows? Maybe Anne's first marriage was unrecorded. Um, the grandmother who married John Smith. I know that Anne Smith probably had children before her marriage to John Smith, because my cousin, who is a great granddaughter of Jerome, did the DNA test for me. We did not have a match, and we should have as closely related as we thought we were. Was it a non-matrimonial event? Did Rachel jump somebody out behind the barn or what? Or, I think it might have been an adoption. There's a history of adoptions in this family. In John Smith's will, it says that Drum was born out of wedlock 3 times. He doesn't say how, if he was his son, Anne's son, or somebody else's son, but he does state that. There's no doubt that Jerome Smith was born out of wedlock. So I'm just thankful that my mother died before I found all this out, or she's probably rotating in her grave. So all I can say is the buyers need to beware. There may be Smiths hanging from your family tree. So, any questions?
You mentioned a soldiers and sailors database. What is that within?
Yeah, it's a National Park Service record. Use it while it's still there. And I love it. If I'm in Oklahoma, people will often not know where their family came from. But I will search for like a name of someone who came to Oklahoma that was old enough to be in the Civil War, and that may tell me where they came from. And it gives that nice little biography of the unit. And then you can send off for the military records. Remember, for the Confederates, the military records for Confederacy are on Fold3. Although I sent off to the National Archives, that's before they were available free. And they're putting the Union records on Fold3 too, but there's just so many of them. And for pension records for the Civil War, you go through the federal government. For pension records for the Confederate, you go to the states. And they may have applied it in more than one state. Like I have found people who served in Arkansas, they moved to Texas after the war, so they applied there, and then they may have come into Oklahoma when it opened up, and you apply again. But a lot of veterans had died before the Confederate pensions were offered. It was about 1910 that a lot of states started giving them. And don't forget to search for the widows too, because widows could apply after their husbands were deceased. Does that help?
Yeah. Thank you.
Any other questions? Thank you very much, Nancy.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Have a good evening.